Hallå, hörs det? Ja. God morgon allihopa. Jag heter Hedvig och kommer ifrån Göteborg. Jag är en av 13 medarbetare på Göteborgs centrum för kompetensutveckling. Många av oss är här idag. Det är väldigt kul att komma till Stockholm. Och idag har jag fått glädjen att presentera Nora Bateson som är den här andra dagens på konferensen keynote speaker. Och ja, vad ska man säga? What to say about Nora? Who is Nora? Well, she's a person from many contexts, actually. So to mention some of them, you are actually an author, and you are an educator, and you are also a filmmaker, and you made the award-winning film. The name is An Ecology of Mind, isn't it? Yeah, about her father, Gregory Bateson. And you run the Bateson Institute here in Stockholm, actually, in Sweden, yeah. And what do you say? Performing research from the Transcontextual processes, and also what do you say? Also. I lost the word. Not used to standing like this. But anyhow, also to give you another little glimpse, Nora just arrived from San Francisco, right? And she was in a conference or an anniversary of the Institute for Future Studies. And what happens? Nora's always into new contexts. And when she had made her keynote speak, what happened? Yes, Microsoft turned up to Nora and said, we need you, we want you. Yeah. And also Renova in Sweden. So this is what happens. So we're really happy to have you here because you're actually traveling around the world all the time. And we have to have a hold on you here in Sweden now. So really. And you're carrying the heritage from your father, Gregory Bateson, who's been so important to all us family therapists. And actually also from your grandfather, William, was he? Yeah. And not only carrying those ideas, but also developing them further on. And you actually also invented a new word. That's a cliffhanger. We will see. So we warmly welcome you, Nora. I think the world is ready for you, and we are ready for you to this exciting day.
Thank you.
Just a little practical thing. If you have questions, there will be a few minutes in the end. So we'll save them for the end.
Make them fast.
Make them fast.
Okay. Well, I think we don't need this one because we have this other one. Good morning. I'm going to take you on kind of a wild ride, so I hope you've had your coffee and you're ready to go. I was thinking about what to say in this talk this morning, and as Hedwig said, I've been moving through a lot of different contexts. I work with ecologists, I work with politicians, I work with educators, artists. I was just with these people who are working quite a bit in technology, but also in questions, philosophical questions. What does our future mean to us? What is this? How are we going forward? Not just we as in you and I, but we as in the family of humanity, we as in all the other organisms in our biosphere. So, there's not very many people who get to move between all these different contexts. And the reason that I have this privilege, which I really consider a privilege, it's a lot of hard work as well, but is that the work that I'm doing is about how to perceive and thinking about what it means to be inside complex living systems, and at the same time to be a complex living system. So, of course, ecology is about complex living systems. Education is about complex living systems and interaction with complex living systems. Politics is a complex living system of complex living systems, right? So pretty much everywhere you turn, you get this complex living system pattern. And right now, in our world, this is an important place to start. We, humanity, and the thousands and trillions of other organisms, we're faced with a lot of crises. And all of those crises can be defined as complex systems. So our ability to respond to those crises that are around us at our most intimate levels, questions of gender and identity and our marriages and our families and our parents and children, our bodies, but also our politics, our relationship with the ecology, that internally and externally, this theme of complexity keeps coming back. And our ability to respond to that is made at least a little better if we can be more familiar with what that is. So, who are we? How do we go forward? What is this world that we're in? How can we come to understand it? And so I titled this talk today, Finding Our Way in a Changing World. Humility, integrity, and ambiguity. My husband taught me the word for ambiguity in Swedish last night, but I forgot it and I wrote it down, so we'll get to that. But the question really is, who are we in this time of unscripted ethics? We are in a moment where life is changing quickly at unprecedented rates, and how we perceive ourselves and the world around us is of critical importance right now. As Hedvig mentioned, I'm coming to this question through generations of work and of deep study on complexity. And my father asked this question in his book, Mind and Nature. What pattern connects the crab to the lobster and the orchid to the primrose and all the four of them to me and me to you? The pattern which connects is a meta-pattern. It's a pattern of patterns. If you're familiar with my father's work, you've probably heard this question before. But what I wanted to kind of bring up with you today and to bring it back into the family sphere is to let you know that this was the question that surrounded every single aspect of our lives as a family. When we were having breakfast, the question around breakfast was, what is the pattern that connects this breakfast? And when we were on a walk, the question was, what is the pattern that connects this tree, this mushroom, this bird, this spider? And when I was dealing with school and having trouble with the other kids, my parents asked me, what is the pattern that connects that friend, their parents? Right? So that everything that I did as a child happened through this lens. What I didn't really get at the time is that I was learning how to do complexity. It didn't matter. I wasn't doing complexity. I was just living life and asking the question, how are these things connecting? What are the connections that are taking place in this relationship that I might not immediately see unless I go looking for? And as a child, I can tell you that question didn't seem to be overly intellectual or adult. It was just a lens. It was just a way of approaching any situation. Right? What are the patterns that are connecting here? And I wanted to bring this in for a couple of reasons. One is I hardly ever put covers of my dad's books and my PowerPoints. But I wanted to today because I really wanted to focus on the title of this book and to kind of bring this back and, recognizing mind and nature. That the work that is being done at the psychological level in our social services with people is so connected, deeply, importantly connected to the other work that needs to be done around ecology and understanding the world that we live in. It's a source, honestly, of frustration for me that I work with all these ecologists. In a couple weeks, I'll be down in Rome with this big group of people working on the Sustainable Development Goals and the alternative energies and all of these ecological endeavors. And I can tell you, there won't be anybody in that room who will even mention the word family. They won't even mention it. It's like alternative energy is over here and family is over there. The Sustainable Development Goals are some kind of humanitarian, socio-political issue, and family and social services totally disconnected. How did we get here? And how do we put these things back together? I don't think we can deal with really either one of those realms of pain and suffering until we put them together. So that's what I wanted to talk to you about today, is about how we go about doing that. And I kind of want to make the case again and again for how important it is. And it starts right here. Right here. What is the pattern that connects? And the deep healing of this question, the therapeutic properties of this question, not as an intellectual pursuit or as some kind of academic philosophy, but as a way of life, like I was saying, as a way of eating breakfast, right? It's this idea that that we're part of something, that we're part of our context. And that recognition of context is a recognition of our own connections. And that recognition of connections, that's what health is. That's what a healthy system is a system that can recognize and become familiar with the connections that it lives within. We're talking a lot right now in the world about change. How are we going to make change? Change in the way we live, change in the political sphere, change in our ways of being, change in our ways of perceiving. How can we perceive our world in a new way? And this is kind of a puzzle, right? Where is the change? What do we mean by change? Is the change in me, or is it in the context? How do I change myself when the context remains the same? And how do I change the context when I only know how to do tomorrow mostly what I did today? Okay, and yet we have an imperative now. We have a mandate. If I am to look at basically any of the clothing that I have on, or most of the things around this room, if you think about what you had for breakfast and you really start to ask, what are those connections? What they're going to lead you to is several layers of stories that without too many steps backward, end up in exploitation. Who made these clothes? Who dyed these clothes? Who picked this cotton? Who picked the food that was in my muesli this morning? What chemicals are in the soil that the wheat was grown in, that my bread came from? Where are those families? How do those people feed their children? So when I start to ask that question, what is the pattern that connects? There are a couple of things in there. One is the incredible beauty of this interdependent relational world that we live within. And the other is some sorrow of recognizing the kind of objectification and exploitation that's taking place. I'm part of it. I mean, I'm part of it. We all are. Because we are in a context in which the bread that you buy is grown in the way that it's grown. The muesli we put on our cereal is coming from fields with people who are harvesting those raisins or drying that coconut in impoverished conditions. Okay? We are connected to it. We are in the context. And in that sense, the change that we're looking for is contextual. But that's a little bit of a puzzle, isn't it? Who am I in that? Who am I in my context? How can I begin to recognize myself in the context and still not be kind of carried away with it? Right? There's so much identity politics right now that I'd kind of like to be a little bit careful around this and say more that we're talking about the self, so that we don't get kind of trapped into another set of rhetoric around identity. But as we are entering this era of unprecedented change, there is cultural change, ecological change, conceptual change, change in our language, change in our economies. And while there has always been change, and in fact life and a living complex system is defined by change, the changes that we're in now are so quick. They're happening so fast. And when that kind of change starts to take place, there are upheavals. There are leverage points. There are tipping points. There are places at which, times at which the cohesion of a living system begins to come unthreaded. Okay, there's so much movement and so much movement within so much movement that things can get very confusing. And so this question of who are we is not an easy question. All right, and so looking backward, we can say where we came from. And we can justify, authorize, and claim the boundaries of identities. Right? I came from the United States. My father did this. I've come from a scientific background. I am part of that history. And if I wanted to stop there and leave my identity parked at my past, where my past has brought me, I could justify quite a bit. And I could say, I'm doing this because my ancestors have done this. And this is the way it is. And I know that this is the way it is. And this is who I am. Because when I look back, this is how I got here. But right now, for all of us and the roughly 7 billion people who happen to be walking on this small blue orb, that is not enough. We have another question. And that question is, who are we now? Who we were and where we came from is all sorts of beautiful and tragic material. Whatever it is, it's not enough. There's a new level of collaboration, of understanding, of familiarity, of confusion, of shared trauma that we are now in. And how are we going to organize ourselves in this? How are we going to hold ourselves? How shall we communicate with each other? So, to flip back to the first slide about the pattern that connects and my father, the first thing I want to say about this question of identity and this communication around how that process takes place is to say this is an intergenerational process. This is something that happens between parents and children and grandparents and brothers and sisters. So the space that we leave for our children to ask the question, who are we now? The permission that we give, the opening, the oxygen of asking, who are we now, is a really important piece because it changes the ecology of the conversation. All right? It's important to recognize and honor our past. But if we continue to live in the way that we have lived, our species and thousands of others will not make it. The imperative for change rests in our notion of who we are and how we make sense of the world around us. Now, the way in which our ancestors did it, no matter how beautiful and how wise, it wasn't enough because look around, here we are. So now there's a new kind of pressure to ask in a new way, who are we now and what of humanity? Where is the edge of the self? Where do I end? Where is that? Is it my skin? Is it my ideas? Is it my family? Is it my culture? Is it my breakfast? Where's the edge of me? When I ask that question, who am I? Where is the edge of that I? Okay, so Darwin, just to tap into some evolutionary theory here, first thing in the morning. Darwin proposed a theory of natural selection and evolution in which the unit of survival was either the family line or the species or the subspecies or something of the sort. But today it's quite obvious that this is not the unit of survival. In the real biological world, the unit of survival is organism plus environment. We're learning by bitter experience that the organism which destroys its environment destroys itself. So where am I in that? Where are you in that? Where are we? When I'm looking for something I might call health, where is my health? Is my health just in my body and my mind? Or is it in relation to my family? Right? In relation to my community. In relation to the families that are connected to that growing of bread and making of clothes. How can I be healthy if my family isn't healthy? How can I be healthy if my community isn't healthy? how can my community be healthy if the biosphere isn't healthy? What is the pattern that connects? So bringing this back, anybody who's ever been in a talk with me in the last couple of years has seen this slide because I carry it around. I think I need a t-shirt. You know, we know, there's a great appetite for something simple. Just give me something simple. I just want to solve the problem. I want a 5-step solution. I want a manual. I want some tools in the toolbox. I just want to know, like, how to deal with this complexity that I'm faced with because I don't know what to do with it. And if I think about the context and it's also philosophical and it's just not practical and my head's going to explode. Only no, not really. When I hear that, what I'm recognizing is actually that the appetite is not for simplicity, it's for reductionism. Okay, reductionism is what happens when you have a complex system and you cut it into pieces. And you take away its complexity, hoping that that will give you a smaller piece to make sense of. Right? That's the hope. But what happens? It gives you decontextualized information that doesn't have its patterns of connection, that doesn't have its relational properties. And when we separate out complex systems, we can no longer make sense of them. It's very difficult to make sense of a family if you only look at one person. Right? It's very difficult to make sense of a forest if you only study one tree. You can study the tree. You can pull it out of its context. You can look at it. But put it back. Notice those relational patterns. Notice those rhythms. Become familiar. You can't know it or measure it or define it or lock it down or even map it, frankly. But you can become familiar with it, right? So that's the difference. Simplicity is complex, all right? A flower growing is just a simple flower. But look at the complexity that it grows within. Look at the complexity that it takes to produce that simple flower. So don't be fooled into thinking that simplicity you're asking for when what you're actually doing is pulling things out of context. That's reductionism, and that's dangerous if you're trying to make sense of living systems. If you're trying to build an airplane or a laptop, reductionism is just fine. I'm pretty sure in this room no one's building airplanes or laptops. Maybe I'm wrong. But in terms of making sense of living systems, that complexity is really important. And it's not something that we have been trained to feel cozy within. Okay? Most of us tend to panic a little bit around that. So I've been playing with this word transcontextual. Because I work in so many different contexts, I started to notice that it was actually more than transdisciplinary, more than interdisciplinary. What I was working with was actually contexts of communication. And that whether I was working in an ecological context or a political context or an educational context, you know, different aspects of me started to surface in those different contexts. Entire different communication patterns. And I started to really begin to look at this notion that the self is a complex notion. It's a complex idea. That doesn't mean it's a difficult idea. It means it has a lot of contexts in it, all right? So my identity is always shifting and responding and just adjusting, depending on which context I happen to put forth. So when I'm talking to my kids, I have a lot of kids, there's kind of, some aspects of me that are more present with them than with you right now. Right? And likewise, there's aspects of me that are more present with you right now than are present when I'm talking to my kids. But when I'm talking to a room full of people who are working on the Sustainable Development Goals and alternative energy, that's another context with another kind of communication pattern. I can tell you that when I go talk to them, I'll be telling them about families. So how might I improve my understanding of the complexity I'm surrounded with in my context, my outside world, if I can begin to see myself as a multi-contextual being? My gender, my generation, my family, my history, my nationality, my profession, my 40 trillion organisms that live on me and my microbiome that I can't live without. If I can begin to study and become familiar with this idea of myself as a complex system, I might be able to see in you and in the people around me more complexity. I might be slightly less likely to reduce you to a single context. Oh, that person, yeah, he's a family therapist. Right? That person is a bus driver. That person is a mom. That person is a Swede. That person is not a Swede. Those are reductionist descriptions. And we do it all the time. Now, it wouldn't be so bad if we did that and we could remember that those were small little boundaries that we had drawn around an otherwise beautiful, complex system, but we forget that we've drawn those boundaries. That's the hitch. So in an understanding of ecology and in a bringing in of this question of who am I in my world and who am I now, a big piece starts right here. What is the ecology of me? And how can I begin to see that ecology reflected in my community, in the biosphere, in my family? What are those relational processes that I might not have noticed at first? Right back to my childhood breakfast table question. I think it's important to notice that there are several kind of complex systems that are overlapping here. All right, one of those complex systems is the complex system of our own conceptual process, the epistemology, the way we make sense of the world. And how that happens, whoo, that's a big one, right? It's language, it's culture, it's family, it's all kinds of stuff. So that when I'm here in Sweden, there's one way of making sense of even what breakfast is. But when I'm in the States or I'm in China, there's very different ways of making sense of even what breakfast is. All right, different language, different relationship to the seasons, whole different digestive enzymes needed. So it's pretty significant. So another one is the ecological complexity that we live within. All right, so I was just mentioning the 40 trillion organisms, and I was working recently with some friends who are on the Mars project. Are we going to move to Mars? An idea that I think needs a little work. Yeah, I mean, it kind of reminds me of when my kids leave their bicycles in the rain and then they're like, Mom, I need a new bicycle. Maybe you should take care of your old bicycle. And so I was asking them, you know, like, so I'm curious with this Mars program about the microbiome and what happens to these 40 trillion organisms that live on and in me and that I can't live without on Mars? Because those organisms, these organisms, are in a long conversation with this ecology that we live within. By long conversation, I mean several 100,000 years of conversation. So what happens to them if we go to Mars? And I got a message back, yeah, we're going to take that question to the biomedical team. And then they wrote me back the next day and they said, yeah, so we think that is maybe a good project for studying. I was like, yeah. So don't worry, we're not going to Mars. But the third complex system that we are navigating is our cultural complex system. And so much of the why we do what we do or how we're making sense of things is taking place through this through this cultural lens. And it's very, very difficult to know what is something, what is marriage, what is success, what is happiness, what is money, what is death, what is love. Those processes are taking place through cultural expectations, cultural communications, invisible presumptions and assumptions that get passed down across generations. Who are you and what will you be if you are successful? Where did that idea come from? Gender. What does it mean to be a woman? Where did that idea come from? So these cultural complexities are very dense. The ecological complexities are very dense. And our conceptual epistemological complexities are very dense. But don't worry, it's actually very simple. Unless you commit the crime of reductionism, in which case it's a complete mess. So here's the thing, is that we're not meant to be alone. We're not meant to be individuals. This was a piece on, it's on symbionts. So animals cannot be considered individuals by anatomical or physiological criteria because a diversity of symbionts are both present and functional in completing metabolic pathways and serving other physiological functions. Good morning, it's biology class. In other words, I can't digest my breakfast without all those organisms. My breakfast can't happen without the organisms that are in the soil. There is no way for any moment of my day to go on without thousands of organisms being involved. Likewise, those organisms need other organisms. So there's not only this wide party of relationships, there's also a lot of interdependency. We can't live without each other. We are not actually separable. So these new studies have shown that animal development is incomplete without symbionts. And symbionts also constitute a second mode of genetic inheritance, providing selectable genetic variation for natural selection. We are not alone. Where's the edge of the family? Where's the edge of the child? Where's the edge of the mom? The reason I'm pushing this is because there's a tendency to lock down. There's a tendency to want to draw nice, firm lines around roles of what it is to be the child or the mom in a family. There's a tendency to say things, and I know we've all had friends who have said this because we've never said it ourselves. That's just how I am. That's just how you are. That's it. That's it. You're just going to like park yourself like a big bus. That's it. There's no more living processes. There's nothing. How can that even be? Right? One of the things about an ecology is that all the participants in an ecology are in response to each other all the time. So there's always change. So when we ask ourselves, who are we now? That's permission. It's permission to respond in a new way, to begin to perceive in a new way, to start to get out of these patterns. Ecology is a family matter. Really and truly, the place where we learn who we are and how we fit into our world happens at home. Now, I know this is super uncomfortable because maybe you're thinking that you didn't choose to be biologists for a reason, but in a way you did. You're just a different kind of biologists. A family is an ecology, and every member of a family is an ecology. So beginning to allow the conversation to bring in those kind of metaphors, to illustrate those relational processes, even with little children, is a good idea. It allows them to feel connected. It allows them to begin to perceive, the thing is that this next generation of kids needs to be much better at complex systems than we have been. And this is an interesting kind of mandate, because we can't actually teach them what we don't know. So how can we begin to allow them to make connections that we haven't made yet and learn from them? Develop language in the family over breakfast that allows for connective processes and perception and recognition of this self in ways that we are not the experts in. We, the adults, we, the professionals. We actually aren't the experts. I mean, if you look around, we're not doing so well. So how can we make space for this recognition of ecology at all these different levels to start filtering in? Right? Maybe if we could see and perceive and be in that ecology, we would destroy it a little less. Okay? Here's my heavy slide. I'm sorry, but I have to do this to you. All right. This one's no fun at all. This slide is no fun. My point here with all these words is this: the world is changing fast. Okay, so the Gulf Stream system, which keeps Scandinavia in a regulated weather pattern and warm enough to inhabit, is slowing down 450 times faster than scientists anticipated. That's not good. 200 species go extinct, and 1 million tons of CO2 are pumped into the air every day. That means every year we're losing about 15% of, between 10 and 15% of the world's species. That's not good. 75% of the flying insect biomass is already gone. Possible temperature increase, according to the latest ecological scientists, is more like 5 degrees by 2050. But at 2 degrees, we lose 60% of the Amazon, which produces 20% of the world's oxygen. And as we know here in Sweden, forests, even way up north, are burning. And what happens when they burn? The smoke goes into the air, and the soil is toasted. Methane is starting to release in large quantities, and methane is more than 20 times as potent as CO2 as a heat-trapping gas. This is not good. The average person eats 70,000 microplastics each year. Plastic is killing more than 1.1 million seabirds and animals every year. All right, really depressing. I'm so sorry. But the thing is this, is that this kind of stuff is not coming into family therapy conferences. But it really affects the family. It affects not only our physical health, but also our emotional health, also our ability to make sense of our world. How do you think it feels to be a 14-year-old right now when these are the stories that are all over the place? What must it be like to be considering a future? How can we help the kids who are in this moment looking at a horizon? Honestly, you and I, we can't imagine. When we were teenagers, we imagined that we would grow up and we would go to school and we would get a job and maybe we would find a partner and we would have kids someday and, you know, maybe we'd get lucky and buy a car or buy a summer house, have a dog. The idea that for coming generations, those dreams they're not even on the horizon for quite a few of them. This is something serious. And when we start to see not only depression, but anxiety and all these other labeled diagnostic conditions, I think it's really important to recognize that the ecology has something to do with this. And not just the ecology, but also I would like you to look, just blur the words for a second and look at the meta message of this wall. What does the meta message say? Right? That's the kind of message of the message. The message of the message says there's an awful lot of science that says an awful lot of serious things that you can't do anything about, that's full of numbers that you can't control, that has everything to do with whether or not you have a future. That's the meta message. So in the ecology of communication, this is a toxic message right here. There's no place for me in that. Where is my story? Where am I? Where are my organisms? Right? So, just for the record, this is not about recycling. No. This is about an ecology of mind, as my dad used to say. This is about how we learn to think and perceive in ecological ways. And holding that space for each other. It starts at home, between the generations. And it means paying attention. It means generating sensitivity. Now, the hitch with generating sensitivity and paying attention is that it's going to hurt. Some of the things we need to pay attention to are not so pleasant right now. How do we hold that? How do we start to make it possible to collectively hold that pain? Not deny it, not repress it, not go numb to it, because the numbness isn't working out very well, is it? So how can we begin to hold that in the family? Not as a big dark cloud, but as just, this is where we are. We're in this together, across the generations. The world is changing, and we who are alive right now are here for this adventure. Like any adventure, it won't be all fun. Yeah, you see, the thing about complex systems is that change changes it as it changes. So it's really difficult to draw any kind of linearity into this, or to make any kind of clear, this is going to happen and this is not going to happen, and we're going to run out of oxygen, and the Gulf Stream is going to stop, and we're going to have no more mosquitoes, and we can't actually say any of that. Which puts us as adults, as professionals, in a tight spot. Because actually, what in the world are we supposed to say? How are we supposed to hold this? When even the top scientists change their story all the time. How can we begin to recognize ourselves in that process? So, I mean, one thing about that is that certainly, you know, as the forests burn, the ocean gets hotter. As the ocean gets hotter, the blah, 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 blah. Certainly, as the economy becomes more extreme in its differentiation, people respond in different ways to what they want, and so on and so forth. Certainly, as things start to get confusing, the culture is starting to grab for things that make sense. Just make America great again. This is all too confusing. And the same is true with identity. As I start to see myself in a world that's changing, I'm reflected in my context, right? As I start to see myself in a world that's changing, I might not recognize myself anymore. And that's scary. Who am I in a changing world? When the things around me that used to reaffirm my idea of self are suddenly not as they used to be, who am I? Where do I belong in that? So we're starting to get these fractures, these confusions, even about what we're confused about. And I think it all comes back to self, okay? Coming back to that notion of recognizing that as I change, my changes change. And as you change, your changes change. So there's, again, that pulling it back in. When we go global and it's, you know, the insects and the ecology and the culture and it's big, and then zoom back in. How does this complexity, how does it operate in me? How is this transcontextual, responsive, changing patterns, how does that happen in me? Who am I? Sadly, there's no one to tell us how to do this. Nobody knows what to do. Nobody knows how to live in a new way. Our idea of what we're going to do next week is so closely related to what we're doing this week that the idea of continuance, this is, in my dad's theory of the double bind, in order to live, we have to take part in a lot of systems, which I was sort of illustrating earlier, that are inherently deadly. But if we don't, we die. That's a double bind, folks. And how do you get out of a double bind? Okay, a double bind is what happens when you get two contexts that are pulling at each other from different directions. And you can't solve the problem by doing one thing because that puts you in jeopardy on the other thing. All right? You know that moment when you've had a partner and that partner says to you, "You never tell me that you love me." And you think, well, if I tell you now that I love you, you won't believe me because you'll think the only reason I'm telling you is that you're asking me to. But if I don't tell you, then you're right. And so, either way, you're screwed. Right? It's a little like that, where we've got two contexts pulling at each other. And the process of getting through double binds has to do with a couple of things. One is get creative. Make space for new patterns to come in. Allow new entry points. New perspectives. New connections, new associations. And the best way to do that is to actually bring in more contexts. If you get stuck between two contexts that don't work out, get a third and a fourth and a fifth and a sixth. You remember when we were told if you have a difficult problem, the first thing you need to do is simplify? Forget that. When it comes to living systems, if you get in a crisis, the first thing to do is to add complexity. Don't take it away. And in the complexity, possibilities start to pop up. Unforeseen possibilities. But for now, no one actually knows what to do. So how about that? I started off saying that we were going to talk a little bit about unscripted ethics. And this is what I mean, is that we're in a moment that is unprecedented. The changes we're facing have never been faced the way we're facing them now. And we don't actually know. I mean, let's take, for example, the Me Too moment. All right? So in the Me Too moment, we suddenly have brought into our cultural communication and our conceptual relationships a new attention and sensitivity to gender relationships in the workplace and all over the place. Sweden's been a little bit ahead of the game on this, but not innocent. So now what? I mean, I have a 23-year-old daughter and a 21-year-old son, and they're out in the dating world trying to figure out, like, okay, now what happens? Because the scripts of dating, the scripts of how you make contact with someone, the scripts of how you recognize if someone is attracted to you or you're attracted to them, and how you initiate communication and affection and intimacy, those scripts are all broken and gone. So now these kids are out there kind of going like, what do I say? What do I do? Because the old scripts are gone. But the new scripts don't exist yet. And if they're sensitive human beings and they don't actually want to hurt anyone, the most appropriate response they have is, what do I do now? So what are the ethics that they are operating within? How do they begin to find who they are and who their potential partners are? It's not easy. I mean, I think that's okay. I think not easy and feeling a little bit lost is a huge improvement upon having a script that's actually hurting people. Are you with me? Yeah, but it's not clear. It's really not clear. And that ambiguity, oh, there's that word. Okay. Oh, reset. That ambiguity is a challenge. It's a challenge. To not know what to do, to not have the script, to not be told where we are. How much time do I have left? 6 minutes, okay. Is not an easy position to be in. And, you know, in my work, sometimes, you know, I'm telling you, I'm working with all these different groups. Like, right at the edge of all of them, there's the mindfulness work. And one of the things that the mindfulness people like to talk about is emergence. Anybody been talking about emergence lately in their work? And emergence is sort of what happens in a complex living system when new things just pop in. And stuff emerges and paths unfold. And in the mindfulness world, there's a kind of a romance with emergence. It's sort of like the flow. What can happen? I'm from Northern California, so I can play with this. I have permission. But the thing is that the other thing about emergence is that emergency is also emergence. And emergency does not bring about this rosy openness of flow. Emergency shuts that down like a door slamming. Emergency is when the emergence starts to emerge, and it's not pretty, and the first thing you want to know is it right, is it wrong, is it good, is it bad, or is it legal, is it illegal? Am I a good person or a bad person? Did they do it wrong or right? The binaries, right, come screaming in, and all the complexity, poof, vanishes. All that contextual process, all those beautiful blurry lines of wondering what to say and do and imagining the possibilities, gone. In an emergency, whew, it snaps shut. And so what I've learned in teaching systems thinking and systems theory over the last, I don't know, decade or so, more, gosh, I hate to think of that, is that it takes a lot of integrity to do complexity and ambiguity. It takes a lot of integrity to stand in that moment of not having a script and not knowing what to do and paying attention in ways that are rigorous. You have to watch the micro movements. You have to pay attention. All right? Being in ambiguity is not a groovy surfing through the uncertainty of life, man. It's hard work. It means really watching in new ways, watching for things you haven't seen before. And that takes integrity. One thing that I have really noticed is that the people who seem to be the best at dealing with ambiguity are people who have actually been through what I would call the dark night. They've been through something big. And they have had to find in themselves a place from which to respond that they didn't know about before. And the important piece about that is that once you know that, you actually know that you can meet things you don't know, and that you will find a way. You don't know what the script is, but you trust yourself to figure it out. You trust yourself to pay attention. You trust yourself to look deep. It takes a lot of integrity. What? Oh, the trumpet is blowing. All right. All right, I'm skipping. So, there's two things I want to say before we end. This is me and my dad. Looking for the patterns that connect. This is a family process. The search for ecology is an ecology of relationships within us, between us, and in our world. That process starts right there. And it's the best friend a kid can have, is that ecology and access to that ecology. And we don't lose one part of us when we accept the other parts. As we begin to explore the transcontextual complexity of the self, there's no need to be afraid. Nothing will be lost. We can be both local and global, individual and communal. Zoom in, zoom out. You can do both. Fresh skin feels different sensations with incoherent language, new sentences. Arrive on unfound tenderness, unsealing the silenced membrane of numbness. Thank you.
Okay. Nora, we want to thank you really for this, interesting, important, and mind-exercising start of the day, I would say.
Sorry.
That's so lovely to hear you. Yeah, and we will bring all those ideas with us. And this little box I want to thank you with, it's a box of complexity. Complex tastes. Ooh. And I think you will enjoy it because I saw you at the coffee table yesterday.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you.